Friday the 13th is back. Kind of. For those of you who don't know, it appears that A24 won a bidding war to produce a prequel series known as Crystal Lake, which will be produced by Hannibal creator Bryan Fuller.
Did you just smell me?
Difficult to avoid.
For Universal streaming service Peacock.
You know, the same studio that kneecapped the last two entries in David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy, sacrificing a couple of $1 million in order to build their own streaming service, which obviously meant a whole lot more to the studio than just a handful of self-entitled fanboys over the internet. Yeah, I'm sure they're very broken up about it. Just to be clear, I wasn't expecting a whole lot from this series before I heard that it was being produced by A24 and Bryan Fuller is the showrunner. I mean, come on!
I have no taste for animal cruelty, which is why I employ an ethical butcher.
You just can't beat that.
Before we begin, you must all be warned. Nothing here is vegetarian. Bon appetit.
With all of that being said, I wanted to take some time to give you a better understanding of the legal issues that have been plaguing this series for the better part of a decade.
So I'm trying something a little bit different here with this video. It's not just going to be me here talking to you with a pre-scripted discussion, kind of sprinkling a couple of things throughout, me discussing with some of my friends and colleagues in future videos in order to kind of supplement and get a better understanding of not only the topic at hand, but also, you know, just broader perspectives on some of the things that we're here to discuss. So with that being said, I'll welcome MJ to the channel and we'll just jump right into this. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, bro. I'm happy to be here.
So this video kind of took on a life of its own, and while I initially wanted to break down the history surrounding the recent court proceedings of the Friday the 13th films leading into the creation of this show, it kind of morphed.
After 10,000 years, I'm free! It's time to conquer Earth!
Alpha, Reader's Escape. Recruit a team of teenagers with attitudes.
Into a bit of a tangent on the current state of the slasher genre. So, yeah, this video was a complete disaster to put together in time, so if you like it, I kind of hope that you comment, like it, share it with your relevant communities, and just hopefully appreciate the fact that there's someone out here willing to make something like this for you. And given the current state of subscriber to viewership ratio,
you know what I mean?
So before we get into some of the more recent news about this series and what I think it means for the horror genre altogether, I feel like it's important to break down some of the history of this specific case because it's been a big one, and I feel like it's very important for the future of horror in general, maybe even just all 80s icons, not just specifically that genre.
For over a half of a decade, the Friday the 13th series has been subject to a copyright dispute for the ages. As the series producer and first film's director Sean S. Cunningham, along with a group of money-hungry investors, fight against Victor Miller, the screenwriter for the first film's script. This issue arose several years ago after Miller sought to take control of his intellectual property after the first film's copyright expired.
Oh crap.
The reasons and narrative behind what happened during this court case are kind of more complex than what I really wanted to get into over the course of this video, but essentially the court decided that Miller was a contract worker for Cunningham when he was tasked to write what eventually became the original Friday the 13th script.
Oh crap.
Interesting side note here that Sean S. Cunningham and all of his affiliates wanted to make the original movie under the title A Long Night at Camp Blood. But that idea was scrapped when Cunningham came up with the title of Friday the 13th and rushed to make sure that he was the only one with a staple on that title. You know, for what it's worth, I would honestly say that the entire time this has been about the money for Sean S. Cunningham. Everything that he's involved with is not the best in the franchise. So take that what you will.
Anyway, the courts ended up siding with Miller, giving him control to the script and characters associated with the original Friday the 13th film. This ultimately led to Miller's attorney Mark Tabaroff, the same attorney who secured the rights to the Nightmare on Elm Street series for Wes Craven's estate, stating that the win gives them the right to license a remake, prequel, or even sequel motion picture, provided that such film does not use any additional copyright materials.
Oh crap.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
Of course, anyone who looks at this even basically knows that these rights are limited to the characters and stories of the original film, and aren't necessarily tied to the hockey mask wearing, machete wielding adult Jason Voorhees or actual title of the franchise itself.
At least that's the way that it read to me and everybody else who read that decision.
However, Toberoff isn't exactly convinced, stating, Miller now owns the copyright to his screenplay, including sequel rights, but Jason can't be portrayed as any older than in the first film? Makes no sense. Jason was very much a presence in Miller's film. In fact, Mrs. Voorhees channeled Jason.
Killer.
And of course, the first was all teed up for the sequels. Then comes the question of the mask. Do you do a new mask like they often did before? Or do you even need a mask?
At least for me, where I'm sitting, those feel like fighting words. And it feels like Sean S. Cunningham agrees with me based on some of the things that he recently said.
And if it was an adult Jason without a hockey mask, I can't imagine they would be very successful. At this point, despite all of the back and forth over the last decade, both sides are really dug into foxholes. They're not going to throw any grenades, but I don't think anyone is going to be calling for peace talks. All of this to say that this entire issue is focused solely on copyright law in the United States and not the rest of the world. So theoretically, Miller and company could potentially lobby for the production of a continuation of the franchise that could only be distributed in the US. Obviously, this is a move that could have certainly worked in the 1980s when Miller and Cunningham produced the original film, but no one would have it today. Instead, as early as May of this year, Toberoff was suggesting we can license television series exploring Crystal Lake and how Jason became who he is. Think Twin Peaks or Bates Motel, which seems to be exactly what's going on with this new TV show. The good news here is that Variety is now reporting that Victor Miller is working exclusively with Rob Barsanian, the man who is directly behind the rights of the Friday the 13th elements of the franchise that Miller doesn't own thanks to his court victory. Essentially, this means that Crystal Lake, the television series, has access to all the other elements absent from the other films outside of the first one, and basically allows Peacock's Friday the 13th series to do anything that it wants in relation to the iconic horror franchise. This sentiment was later confirmed by showrunner Bryan Fuller, who stated, A24 and Mark Tabaroff, who is Victor Miller's lawyer, have beautifully and excruciatingly assembled all of the Friday the 13th rights. As a streaming series, we have the rights to do everything underneath the Friday the 13th umbrella. Fuller continued, the movie rights are a completely different thing. They are tied up at New Line and are super messy and probably won't be untangled anytime soon. But as far as us chickens in the television industry, roost. We have access to anything and everything that Friday the 13th has done up until this point.
Jason!
While Jason is reminiscing about the good old days of being a bald, retarded kid that can't swim, Tommy uses this opportunity to strike with Jason's machete.
I feel like the easiest place to start here is not only your general reaction to the news, but also some of the things that you would really like to see in this upcoming series.
I'm pretty hyped for it. I feel like we're in a day and age where horror is just coming out left and right. That'll probably be something that you and I actually talk about in the future on Real Talk. So I think there's a precedent for it. I feel like people want to make money off this. I feel like the fans want it. For years, people have talked about the rights for the movies and how, you know, things have been tangled up between different studios to the point to where we've gotten fan films. Like, we've gotten actually pretty good fan films on YouTube just to kind of, I guess, help that starvation for the Friday the 13th franchise. The amount of money that was generated from horror this year, 2022 is probably one of the biggest years that we've had in a long time for consecutive back-to-back horror films. And not just that, but the money that they brought in at the box office. I think there's a couple, if not a few films already over 100 mil that are straight horror.
We've seen Smile, which was supposed to go directly to Paramount Plus, make over $200 million this year alone. Then we actually have Halloween Ends with over 100 million. Terrifier 2 on a budget of $250,000, making over $10 million in the domestic box office alone. I mean, yeah, I
think Nope is close to 100 mil too, or if not already passed it.
It's definitely passed. I think it's definitely passed it. Probably not as much as Get Out or Us, but yeah, like Jordan Peele continues his winning streak.
I'm extremely happy, man. And my whole point with that is, I feel like we are gonna hit that day and age where, who knows, we are probably gonna get a Freddy Krueger television show. We might get more stuff on the big on the small screen, and who knows, in the light of the MCU and Sony and the deal they made over Spider-Man and all the rights that are tangled up there, but yet they're still able to produce content and everyone kind of gets a check out of it. These companies love money, brother, you know, so it's like, that's why I'm hoping that this Friday the 13th thing actually does really well and they make a lot of money off of this, because I would love to see more, and I would love to see all of these other characters that we know and love from the 80s and the 90s come back, even the early 2000s, you know. I would love to see all of this hit the small screen.
So what do we know about this series so far? Well, at the point of writing this script, not much. Bryan Fuller himself has joked with Fangoria, Peacock blew every other competitor out of the water. There was a bidding war on this, and they came in strong and gave us a full season commitment, with a huge penalty if we don't do a second season, so it's kind of a 2-season commitment. He went on to suggest that the series isn't going to be some cheap cash grab, stating, "We're going to have roughly 5 times the per episode budget we had with Hannibal."
Okay, I just have to interject here. That's huge.
If you're familiar with this channel at all, you might know that I have just the biggest love when it comes to the Hannibal series.
Flashback.
But seriously, one of the most interesting things about this series is that it decides to focus on a time period outside of the world of Thomas Harris's books. You see, in the novels, as well as pretty much every on-screen adaptation of these stories, the focus is always on Will Graham or Clarice Sterling as they interact with Hannibal, who is otherwise behind bars or somehow predisposed. Fuller flipped that concept on its head, starting the story off before the Red Dragon storyline and offering up a new lens in which to view the Mad Cannibal. As such, this allowed the actors as well as the audience to fully realize these characters in original stories that fit comfortably within the world of Harris's books. So even if you think that nobody could replace Hopkins as the definitive Hannibal Lecter, you really don't have anything to worry about as you jump into this series, as Nicholson's portrayal is not only fantastic, but it's also not like anything that you've ever seen done with this character in the past.
End of flashback.
Each episode of that show was made for about $158,000 to $750,000. This would likely bring the episode budget amount for Crystal Lake somewhere close to $3.75 million per episode, give or take a couple $100,000. For what it's worth, that number is already a pretty substantial amount for modern television, not to mention one based on a classic 80s horror slasher. Some might say the 80s movie horror slasher.
This is God.
Maybe not everybody.
Anyway, to put that potential production budget into context, you don't need to go much further than the basis that Fuller brought in himself. Hannibal is an absolutely breathtaking visual experience, with each shot seemingly ripped from your own nightmares and made bare for your living discomfort.
Hannibal, at least to me, is one of those shows that can't be truly explained. It's absolutely bizarre that Bryan Fuller and his entire team were able to convince American network television to make 3 whole seasons of this nonsense under the guise of a basic police procedural. If you haven't watched it, do yourself a favor. It is so good.
Adding that context to the fact that the Friday the 13th franchise and Camp Crystal Lake in general doesn't have the most ridiculous set dressing in the world. I mean, AMC has been notorious for slashing The Walking Dead's budget in favor of cheaper filming locations for over a decade now. And I'd still argue that the backwoods of Georgia still look halfway decent in terms of believable set dressing. I think it's pretty safe to say that the potential of a $4 million plus per episode budget could convincingly sell a 1950s summer camp. I mean, hell, that type of budget could elevate the series past its humble beginnings.
What the hell is that? You've got to be kidding me.
Oh, wow.
It's been modified.
Which gets us to our main point here. This series is being produced by A24, the most prominent studio behind elevated horror in the last 20 years.
What does that mean, elevated horror?
You know, it's like scary, but with complex emotional and thematic underpinnings. It's not just some schlocky cheeseball nonsense with wall-to-wall jump scares.
And is being written by Bryan Fuller, being an openly gay filmmaker whose complex ideas about horror and sexuality are frequently intertwined with the stories that he decides to tell.
Dream more now than I used to.
Your dreams were the one place you could be physically safe. Relinquishing control, not anymore.
So yeah, right now it certainly seems that one of the most basic slasher franchises of all time is about to get an artsy and hypersexualized retooling from some of the most unique minds working in modern day horror. So that's kind of a quick and dirty breakdown of who we know is behind the camera. As for potential stars of the series, well, that's another story altogether. The assertion is that the series will act as a bit of a prequel to the original films, at least at the beginning, which suggests that we'll get some kind of iteration of Pamela Voorhees front and center.
And they all went to bed at a reasonable hour and picked up all their litter before leaving!
For what it's worth, I really think Mia Goth would be a really great pick for a young Pamela Voorhees.
If I wasn't an actor, I think I would own a bakery and I would call it Mamma Mia's and I would have blueberry pancakes. It would be a blueberry theme.
If this show is really going to be a prequel, then it kind of makes sense to me that you'd want to cast a younger version of the first film's killer. You wouldn't want to jump the gun and put Jason front and center at the very beginning. Instead, you could take the time to focus on a young mother's grief over the loss of her child, and maybe the adult Jason is portrayed by a figment of her imagination.
Kill her, Mommy.
Yeah, I like high tension. What of it?
Then I'm looking to a new day to come, man.
On an additional note, I guess it really depends on what type of prequel this really wants to be. If it's even a prequel at all.
Because as cool as it would be to see a young Pamela played by the likes of Sosie Bacon.
Hi. I know you're nervous. I just want to have a chat.
It might also be just as interesting to see an older Pamela in the form of Toni Collette.
I just want to die.
But if you ask me, I feel like the only way that this series can work properly is if it hyper-focuses on Pamela as a grieving mother with visions of her grown son that help her murder potential threats levied against the reopening of Camp Crystal Lake. The only other option here, at least the way that I see it, is completely blowing past the pitch of the original film and time jumping to an age-appropriate Jason, who is just the same old man-child who kills for the sake of his mother. Well, you know, until he doesn't. But that's probably in season 8.
I wanted to wrap this back around to Crystal Lake as a series. Now, obviously, the setting, the time period, everything kind of goes into how this show will be portrayed to the audience. And I wanted to get your take on what you think the story could possibly be, when it could be set, and just in general, like, how do you go much further than maybe a season or even 2 seasons? Do you have any inclination on that? Who you would like to see play Pamela Voorhees or Jason even, or maybe even other characters that we know are part of the canon but maybe might not be in the show themselves, like someone like a Tommy Jarvis.
So we've seen this before in a lot of movies and series, but just for people to kind of have a quick idea of what I'm referring to, I'll just bring up Cobra Kai. So Cobra Kai does this a lot, where they'll take one line from like Miyagi, or they'll take like one line, you know, from like a Terry Silver, and it supposedly like explains the whole plot of like the movie 3, or that one line from Miyagi is like a crucial learning moment for like Daniel in one of the seasons, right? I feel like with this prequel, there's one line that kind of stands out to me, and that is in the very beginning of the film when that guy is giving the, I guess like the lunch lady, the one who's gonna be working the food, right, to the camp, the one that gets her throat sliced a little bit into the film. So he mentions that there's been fires, floods, you know, the killings of those 2 camp counselors or whatever, and then he says kids going missing around there. I feel like if this is a prequel, and if they want to go far back enough, you can do like a Pamela, maybe portrayed by a younger character or a younger actress. Excuse me, we've discussed Mia Goth off air. Obviously, her connection to, you know, A24, her being the star of the recent trilogy, X, Pearl, Maxine. Makes sense. I think she's a phenomenal actress, and plus Pamela is going to be doing a lot of what I assume, talking to a character that isn't there. So I think it makes a lot of sense if you want to cast someone for that role. But nonetheless, get back to the point. I think you could play a lot with that. Kids going missing. I feel like maybe you could incorporate the fact that those 2 camp counselors weren't the first people, or the first 2 people that Pamela killed, and they weren't the last. Like the fires, the floods, who really cares about that? I mean, if they want to include that maybe she sets the camp on fire at the end of the season or something, sure, why not, right? But I feel like the kids going missing, you could really use that a lot, and you can maybe even create a whole season off of, or like at least like the first few episodes or the full season, however long this prequel part is going to be, where it's her stalking a group of kids. You know, the ones that went missing supposedly. I think that could be a cool thing. I think that could work, you know? And then you can have her seeing Jason, whether it's his adult, like her idea of what he would look like as an adult, or whether it's the kid, whatever it is. I know in the movie she speaks and she's using the baby voice, like the kid Jason voice. So however it works, I think that could be something they could go off of. I think that's a little bit of a, because it's such an easy line, you know, kids going missing there. It's like, that's so much you could run with, you know? Like if I'm writing that, I'm taking that there, I'm giving these kids names, I'm giving them backstories, let's go, you know, real quick. So at least that's what I would do. But I don't know, what do you think?
I feel like you could definitely create a backstory for Camp Blood. As we talked about the idea that this was supposed to be called A Long Night in Camp Blood before it was Friday the 13th, is suitable ground for them to come back and say like, oh, this is everything that we wanted it to be. This is exploring the history of this franchise outside of the world of the films, but they can still live in tandem with each other. Like you could watch the first season of this show and then go watch the first movie and they still align. The thing is I'm not entirely sure how long the series itself can be and what it is that they're trying to do. I feel like your idea is really interesting for a first season. These characters, right. These characters you have kids who are either going there for camp purposes or even not camp purposes who get caught up in Pamela Voorhees' mess and her crazy mind.
I was going to say, because according to that guy, the one who's telling the story, people have been thinking that place is haunted for years, right? Like it opened and closed. Like the original guy from the movie, his parents had owned the camp at one point, right? The camp, the main counselor or whatever. So it's like, there's a lot you can go off of there. And if it really is this full-on prequel, then I think you could do some stuff there. Because that's the one thing I like to say, is that things don't have to be too overly complicated. Like, I do love elevated horror. I do love when things are there for you to pick apart and you have to think about it days later. But at the same time, though, like, if you want to just keep it simple and just kind of grab people in, that's a quick way to do it.
While I agree with that, I feel like one of the things I would really like to see over the course of this series, and I feel like, especially if you're going to be focusing on Crystal Lake as an entity beyond Jason or Pamela or anybody else in this franchise, I feel like Crystal Lake, at least to me, is outside of Jurassic Park the one establishment that I really want to be is the one establishment I really want to see open for business. And I feel like we've only really got that in Jason Lives, the 6th entry, but it didn't have time to explore that the kids are actually at the camp now. And I feel like if you have the television budget that they have and the ability to tell a longer form story, then we can explore the concept of children being actively at this camp for the summer. And it's not just being, taken out before anything could be opened because that was just the most cost-effective thing. I don't know per se whether that's the first season or the second, or however they build this. The first movie plays it very close to the chest and shows that there are counselors and campers sitting around singing Kumbaya, and Pamela goes around and kills people, and that's how it got its Camp Blood moniker shut down and everything. But we have never really explored that over the course of 12 movies. Like I said, very briefly in the 6th. So to me, that's something that I would really like to see, especially if we're going to be focusing on a young Pamela Voorhees, because she was obviously very in line with what this camp wanted to do. Jason was either a participant or was there because she had to work, and I feel like showcasing that tragedy and hyper focusing on her dealing with it makes for compelling television in such a way that Bryan Fuller, I think, from what I've seen from his filmography, is more than capable of internalizing and expressing through a visual medium.
I think it'll be cool, dude, because there's a lot of material there, and I feel like when you put together some of the greatest minds in horror, it seems, that are going to be working on this, I feel like we can get some good stuff out of it. I can just imagine now, how beautiful each episode is going to look, because, the lake, the forest and everything, it's the cinematography, I can imagine, is going to be off the chain. So that's also something to look forward to, and that'll help ease us in to actually put us there at Camp Blood, aka Crystal Lake, So.
However, despite all of this, and based off of everything that we've talked about before, it's starting to seem like this series won't be based solely off of the prequel concept that it was announced as. With Bryan Fuller stating himself, I think over the course of the series, you will see many manifestations of Jason.
And look, if that's the case, I'm sure this series will be relatively good. Jason is an iconic slasher villain, and giving him new life in any medium, especially that of television, could definitely result in some unique storytelling potential.
Except, And maybe it's just me, but I can't help but feel like all the legal maneuvering to ensure that the classic adult hockey mask wearing Jason can and will show up in this prequel says a lot more about the current state of horror in the early 2020s. And honestly, if there was a specific thesis about what this video turned into, it's that audiences today are starved for horror icons that spawn a litany of sequels in this day and age.
I like that movie. It was scary.
Wow, well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
You know what? For as much praise as Wes Craven absolutely deserves for his contributions into the horror genre, I'm going to have to call him out on that specific jab, and just let me explain.
Since the birth of cinema, sequels have been a large part of the economic reality of Hollywood. This is because most movies, especially originals, don't immediately offer the same marketable elements that drive audience awareness and sell tickets in the same way that established franchises do. Additionally, I think it's important to understand that even though every film is an artistic expression that deserves to be subjectively judged on its own merits, the reality of the situation is that Hollywood executives love the idea of established IP because ultimately it offers them a potential out when it comes to surefire hits that don't perform the way they expected. I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, it's easier to point to a spreadsheet of measurable data from box office performance, social media engagement, and previous sales records to say, based on all of this information, we can't fully understand why Morbius failed. Maybe we didn't release it at the right time.
That's a job.
And we love it.
This type of thinking exists amongst all genres and artistic expressions in the world of cinema. It's just that when it comes to the horror genre, the budgets of each individual film are smaller. So lines between mid-level success and outright hit are a lot more blurred than the typical genre fare. As such, horror sequels have always been some of the safest bets in Hollywood, as they're almost always guaranteed to put audiences in their seats. And this was certainly the sentiment of the 1980s, a decade lost to the rat race of trying to find the next big horror icon, the type of established character that headlines not only their own film series, but a multimedia empire. This was the decade where Michael Myers returned home, Freddy Krueger haunted everyone's dreams, Chucky just wanted to play games, Pinhead gleefully showed us such great sights, and Jason Voorhees stalked campers at Crystal Lake.
Now, obviously, all of those franchises have had their ups and downs over the last couple of decades. So much so that Ghostface from the Scream franchise has pretty much joined their ranks as an iconic slasher villain, despite his entire origin being somewhat of a parody of what all of these slashers became through the late 80s and early 90s.
There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
I mean, are you like picking up a vibe or something?
That sentiment now, even more than ever, is certainly up for debate, but as it stands, horror icons are built off of the back of sequels. Doesn't matter what the point is.
So why is all of this important in the year 2022, and what, if anything, does it have to do with the Friday the 13th prequel series that was announced to be coming to Peacock? Well, last year, according to a poll for Morning Consult, 53% of Americans said that they wanted prequels and sequels to their favorite franchises, while 45% of consumers indicated that they are excited to see upcoming prequels and sequels because there was more story to tell. 36% cited nostalgia as a reason, while roughly 1/3 said that they missed watching their favorite characters. From what can be easily gathered from that information, a majority of moviegoers want continuations of their favorite franchises, while a considerable amount of those individuals are supporting these projects for nostalgia purposes. According to a study published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, nostalgia can specifically help people who deal with a fear of mortality by making individuals feel as though their lives are meaningful and valuable. Nostalgia can remind us all that it's possible to overcome hardships and can also give our lives purpose. Additionally, other studies have found that nostalgia can help remind us that there is good in the world, making it easier to look forward to the future and to feel like our best days are in front of us. This, by and large, is why I believe that horror, for better or worse, is the genre of escapism for the general audience. The horror genre is one of those fantastic mediums that can transport the audience to a place where they could never have imagined themselves being, but one not so terribly outside the realm of reality where everything loses its meaning. Sure, you can find the same in comedies.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Did Caesar live here?
No.
I didn't think so.
Or adventures. Or even romance.
It wasn't over. It still isn't over.
Nothing is over! Nothing! You just don't turn it off!
But at least to me, there's always been something just so unique and interesting about trying to scare yourself.
Dallas?
Even though it sounds counterintuitive, there's just something so calming about it. I've always chalked this up to the fact that horror can break us away from the mundane distractions of our day-to-day lives, temporarily releasing us from the responsibilities of our 9-to-5 or upcoming final exams.
You savor everything, be it a glass of water or a walk in the park.
The clock is ticking, John.
But most people have the luxury of not knowing when that clock's gonna go off.
For me, the horror genre, unlike every other popular storytelling medium out there, can take a step all the way back and subconsciously remind us that every day is worth living, because it's a storytelling medium that fully allows us, the audience, to identify with the bad guy, elevating our collective fears around the unknown and offering an exploration outside of our daily routines. It gives us a chance to identify with our own dark sides, both individually and collectively, as kind of a cathartic societal purging of our darkest, most human desires. The same type of emotions that aren't easily expressed in polite society.
Please just let us purge.
And I honestly think that this is an important emotional sentiment to keep in mind when trying to remember the main thesis of this argument, that people today are starved of horror icons.
There may be something real wrong with me.
Today, the world around us feels just a lot more fragile than it did just even a few decades ago. And based off of everything that we've just talked about, with nostalgia playing a huge part in people's comfort with watching sequels, prequels, or continuations of their favorite properties, is it any wonder that we've seen an increase in audience interest in established horror brands over the last few years? This year alone, we've seen the third chapter of David Gordon Green's Halloween franchise slide past the $100 million mark worldwide, as the Scream franchise came roaring back from irrelevancy after a failed attempt about 11 years ago. All the while, Predator, Hellraiser, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre have found enormous success in the world of streaming. And at the same time as all that, we've seen film producers push for a gigantic expansion into the Strangers franchise, and Netflix is considering more entries into the Fear Street series. And at the same time, you can't forget the fact that the Chucky franchise continues to find success on the small screen, and the absolute sensation that is Art the Clown's success in the world of independent film distribution. All of this on top of, as I previously mentioned, the estate of Wes Craven looking for the right pitch to bring Freddy Krueger back into the fold.
You know what? That's something that we're probably going to have to discuss on this channel soon. I have my own personal idea of what I would really like to be a swan song for Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger, but, you know, another time. For whoever's in charge, call me. I feel like, in a way, the amount of money you have to spend in order to make genre fare, something like horror,
right,
is somewhat decent for these individual streaming networks. If they can get their hands on the Texas Chainsaw rights or more Fear Street content or something like this, it's cost incentive to go, there's this huge market for these characters. Not just even the genre itself, but these specific characters that we can exploit and spend very little money on and get a huge return. People will subscribe and continue to subscribe for more content. And I feel like, at least in the streaming era, we can actually see a continuation of the yearly output of these iconic characters, or maybe even new characters that someone like Netflix or Paramount, HBO Max or someone, they just create out of whole cloth, and then they just give us more of these series every single year on just like a every Halloween basis. It becomes a tradition.
Yeah, the amount of references in Stranger Things alone off of all the 80s horror icons, bring them in, bro. Like, let's get the real deal. Enough of the references and the homages. Let's get the real characters back. I don't have the numbers in front of you, and plus it's not like Netflix really gives us, you know, real analytics anyways, so I can't talk to you about that right now. But what I will say is what I saw, and what I saw was season 4 was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. TikTok, YouTube Shorts, YouTube video clips, Instagram Reels, Twitter. It was everywhere. I think it was trending for like, what was it, like, was it the entire week that it was like trending, right? Or like at least a few days straight.
The entire month.
The entire month, yeah. The reason why I'm bringing this up is Mark and I took notice of it. A couple of my friends took notice of it. I'm pretty sure there's some studios out there that took notice of it, some streaming networks as well. And you know, man, you've seen it with the MCU. People like to copy. I'm pretty sure people went in on some of that action, dude. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every streaming show that comes out can replicate the hype and success of Stranger Things. I'm not telling you that. What I am telling you, though, is we know how big it can get. And there's a lot of money to be made there, man. Because like I said, it ain't just the contracts that are signed. It ain't just the money that comes in from the numbers. It's also the amount of royalties you get, the YouTube checks. You're talking about TikTok. Instagram is monetized now. Companies can take advantage of that. Like, there's just so much that you can do, and there's so much reach you have now that I am not surprised that Friday the 13th has so much money being thrown into it. And I'm definitely not surprised that people want to bring in a horror icon, and you know, let's see if we can hit those trends. Let's see if we can get some numbers up, and let's see if everyone can make some money, you know, because Stranger Things, dude, it's insane. Like, I've never seen something trend for that long, like literally on the trending page worldwide. And the amount of tweets from everybody, even people that I wasn't even following or friends with, mutuals even, I would just see just so many tweets, you know. By the way, don't get it twisted. We're not saying Stranger Things caused Friday the 13th, the prequel series. It's more so just the pillars of success that we're seeing. Like, there's the Stranger Things season 4 that just took the world by storm. Then there's also Halloween 2018, which made so much money, and you know, Michael Myers has been like a thing for the last few years, right? So it's like, and then Chucky being on TV now. There's a lot of factors that play into this, and it just makes total sense to me. Like, I think when I first saw the initial tweet, I was kind of shocked, like, oh wow, we're getting this. But the more I thought about it, I'm like, okay, yeah, it makes sense. Bring it on, dude. Do whatever y'all want, and I win it, bro. I'll pay for it. Give it to me, you know.
And I, you know, all the point to you that they are seeing the success of that. I really,
I would have to imagine. How could you not?
Right, and I would, yeah, you would have to imagine that everyone sees that success, and from our very, very minuscule pool of our own social media networks and echo chambers, yeah, like, I think that's the thing that really stands out this entire year. It's not the ending of The Walking Dead, the ending of Better Call Saul, Killing Eve. Pretty much everything on AMC is ending, as we've talked about on this channel before, but
right,
you know, it's not even the reintroduction of some classic icons. It's not any of this stuff. The thing that you could not escape for the life of you was Stranger Things. And yeah, I would be hard pressed to say that that's not something that played very heavily into everyone's decision to not only do a television show like this in order to get around the entire legal battle, but, you know, put so much money into it. We're not entirely sure about the episode count, and I'd be shocked if it's anything over like 6 or 8 episodes. But even still, about $4 million per episode. If Bryan Fuller, the showrunner, is to be believed, then yeah, like that's more than enough to conceptualize and bring to life Camp Crystal Lake and the carnage that you want to ensue.
So I once again want to bring us back around to the idea that horror icons are a staple of the genre. And despite a couple of decades filled with elevated haunted films based off of original Japanese movies, the dominance of torture films leading into cheap but profitable found footage fare, only for the whole thing to go back around to stylized haunted house movies, sprinkling in some breakout elevated horror throughout, I think audiences today are starved for the reintroduction, or for lack of a better word, reproliferation of the classic horror icons.
I honestly think that this current trend is being kept alive with the retoolings of various horror icons like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Ghostface, and it's even being held together by lesser icons having multiple sequels like Jigsaw and...
Oh my god, boys, it's the Nun.
But honestly, in the long run, I feel like the entire point of this video is to say that some of this recontextualization and reestablishment of classic horror icons is going to remanifest itself with the creation of certain new icons for Generation Z and other generations for the future. I definitely have hope that we're not going to be seeing an endless barrage of Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and the like for the endless future.
You a dead meat slime bag!
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you.
Yo, man, it's cool. It's cool, man. It's cool.
Well, you know what? Okay, maybe we will, but those aren't going to be the massively popular things that go into 2030 and 2040 and beyond. Some of the things that are going to be introduced this decade are going to stick and become the same classic characters that we grew up with for this new generation. And I feel like that's really important, as well as incredibly exciting for all horror movie fans. Now, whether you agree or not is really up to you. For me, it's kind of one of the more interesting things about this entire thing so far. I think it's awesome, but that's just my take.
The KRW Network.
Dude, I saw a lot of people sign up. I forgot to tell you this. I saw a lot of people sign up just to watch Orphan First Kill on Paramount. And I was thinking in my head, and maybe I'm ignorant, but I was thinking in my head, am I seeing more people talk about Orphan First Kill than like, I forgot what it was that was popping at. I think it was Better Call Saul. Like the indie, like at least on my timeline, I don't know if that was it or not, but it was like a very popular show or movie that just came out. I'm like, am I seeing more people talk about Orphan First Kill? I didn't even realize there was like an audience for this, you know? Oh, I just signed up. Oh, it was so good. I just signed up. I'm gonna cancel in a month, but you know, I signed up for this. I'm just like, really? Okay.